The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science, technology, and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. This episode, we've got a real cool treat for you. We have an actual Star Warsologist. I'm your host, James Floyd. I am a writer for Star Wars Insider Magazine and StarWars.com.
And I am your other co-host, Melissa Miller. I am the science and technology writer at Nerdist, and I also do articles for Star Wars Insider. Our guest expert today is Don Bies. He used to work at ILM and at Lucasfilm. He was an archivist, a droid wrangler, and he even appeared on screen as Boba Fett. Welcome, Don.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to see you. We did a little brief chat with you at Star Wars Celebration. That'll be up as an episode of Skywalking Through Neverland, but it's great to get to do a deep dive with you and have a full episode. So I'm really excited about that. Can you tell us a little bit more? I know I listed a few of your credentials there, but I'm sure I missed a whole bunch. A little bit more about everything that you've done that's at all Star Wars related and how you got into the field.
Yeah, well, the only other thing I think you missed, I was a model maker at ILM, but you covered everything pretty well. Let's see, I got into filmmaking. Well, I love filmmaking since I was a little kid. My first awareness of film and special effects and making things was I was about 6 years old, and I saw the Frankenstein, the Boris Karloff Frankenstein. And as opposed to scaring me, it fascinated me as to how do they make that man look like that? You know, what did they do? And this being a long time ago, long before the internet, there was very little information out. So I asked my mother, and she's like, well, they used makeup. And, to me, makeup was like what women put on themselves, it wasn't. And so I tried as hard as I could to find, any information. And I grasped onto Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. And that, opened up a whole new world to me. And then within that was at one point a handbook for to do your own makeup effects, and it was by a guy named Dick Smith. And for those that don't know, Dick Smith was a premier makeup artist. They called him the godfather of makeup. He did The Exorcist, he did Dustin Hoffman and Little Big Man, he did Salieri and Amadeus. He was the teacher of people like Rick Baker and more modern makeup effects artists. And he showed how to do makeups with household items, Caro syrup and cotton, and you had to buy a few things from the theatrical supply store, but he even had those resources available to him. So I started doing that. In the meantime, I just was devouring any film that I could. I was really into anything, of course, with makeup. So all the Universal horror monsters, into Planet of the Apes. I was really into apes generally. King Kong. And then 76 King Kong's De Laurentiis as King Kong, which was the Kong himself was played by Rick Baker. I came out, and the movie itself sucked, but the makeup, I loved the makeup.
Was that the one where like King Kong emerges from like behind a giant gas pump? Like that was the sponsor that brought him? Okay, yeah. I have a very vague memory of seeing that. I think maybe in the drive-in or something when I was a toddler.
Yeah. Yep, that's the one. And it was like a big budget. It was, I think it was $24 million to make. And anyway, the whole thing was I was into apes, saw that and saw the apes. And then in 77, this movie came out that there's a teaser for it, probably on TV or something. I saw it, and it had what looked like another ape. It's like, oh, cool. I got to see that movie. And it turned out it was Star Wars. It was Chewbacca. And that's how I discovered Star Wars. And at that point, once Star Wars came, and the other thing that happened the same year Star Wars came out, it was 1977, and I had my first job, and my first job was working at an amusement park outside of Chicago. And it was called the Old Chicago Amusement Park, and it was the first indoor amusement park. It's no longer there. It was only lasted about 5 or 6 years. But they came to film a movie there, and I worked in the games department. They came to shoot a movie, and it was Brian De Palma's movie, The Fury. They had a sequence that happened at the park where the telekinetic kid is mad, and he puts a ride through a restaurant window. So to see the behind the scenes working of a movie firsthand, because I was working there, I could come in and out whenever I wanted to. So I took days off and I just hung out watching them make this movie.
Cool.
And I got to meet people like William Tuttle, who was a makeup artist who had done Seven Faces of Dr. Lao, and he had done The Time Machine. And then the special effects guy was a fascinating guy named A.D. Flowers. And A.D. Flowers, among his many things, was he did Tora, Poseidon Adventure, Towering Inferno. He did all these great effects. And he was a physical effects guy, real hardened kind of, old guy. He's probably about 100 years old then. I don't know, he lived for another 100 years. And he apparently worked on Wizard of Oz, which I didn't know at the time.
Wow.
Watching those guys do their thing, how they rigged the ride to go through, it was all fascinating. So sold me. I figured I got to do this for the rest of my life.
Amazing. I'm glad that you mentioned the Star Wars influence on that. I remember, so Don and I met through the Grant Imahara STEAM Foundation. He's one of the board members. And then we talked a lot about ILM and his time there. And I remember you telling me that at ILM, you sort of had to be closeted if you were a Star Wars fan at the time that you worked there. But you were one of them, then, I take it.
Yeah, it's funny, the later generation, and by later, I only mean the kids that were 10 years younger than me, like Fawn Davis and Granny Mahara and those guys, they were a little bit more open about their fandom, even though they were still had to be reserved. Whereas I couldn't, I was afraid to say anything, that I was working with these giants. I just thought the moment they know, they just throw me out.
So was everybody there actually like you? They were all afraid to bring it up because they don't want to be that first guy and they get made the example of. And
yeah, I think so. Well, the funny thing is because, of course, the guys that were there from the beginning weren't fans because they did it, right? They were, but at the same time, I think they knew that they had made this amazing thing. And of course, they realized, the work they had done. Not all of them were fans of films. A lot of them were just like industrial design type people. But as they grew the crew, there were a number of people that they hired that, of course, were fans, predating me as well. So right. Now that when we get together, we talk about, that time together. And even the old guys are like, yeah, that was a lot cool. That was pretty cool, wasn't it?
That's great. Well, and especially, so the first thing I'd love to talk about is the R2-D2 fleet, because those are some of my favorite pictures is, you amongst the dozen or so R2-D2s. But that for me would certainly have been a geek out moment. R2-D2 is my favorite character in all of Star Wars. And to see 12 of them, I would definitely fangirl over that. So tell us a little bit about what you did and what all had to be updated from the original versions for preparing for the prequels.
Yeah, there actually were 16. We only used 12. We only pulled together 12 for episode 2. So just going back, R2 was my favorite character when I saw Star Wars. The whole movie was amazing, but R2 is just, there's something about R2, and I think it has to do with that he's kind of like the trusty family dog, but even smarter, and he could fix things, and stuff. So when that came out, I gotta have my own R2. So I built my own R2. By 1978, roughly 78, 79, I had it completed.
Wow.
And it was radio control, full size, best as I could. I got the model kit and I scaled everything up off of there. The size was actually based on the diameter of the dome that I could find. And the only thing I could find that would work as a dome was garbage cover those dome garbage covers with the little push-in thing.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
And we had one at my high school, and a good friend of mine who was kind of known to be bit of a juvenile delinquent, I offered him a ride home if he could get me. He did. So I think the statute of limitations are gone on that. But I took that dome, and that was roughly about 18 inches in diameter, 17, 18 inches in diameter. I took Bondo car putty, filled up the front, and I did that's how I made the dome. And then from that, I was able to determine the diameter of the body and all that. So I learned a lot about just making stuff. And
so had you made other stuff before, or this was just like R2-D2 is what I want? I got to figure out how to make stuff now to be able to make my R2-D2.
I had made model kits, and my dad was very handy. We had a little workshop in our basement, and we had some basic tools, table saw, drill press, that sort of thing. And he was kind of into watching me do this. So he would help me by where he worked. He would be able to get some pieces of metal cut down to the right size. And so, yeah, no, I had never done it before, but I figured, well, how hard could it be? The beauty of being young and ignorant. So I just made one. And, it was reverse engineering it. It just, you figure out, okay, well, I need this. How do I get to here? And it's a skill actually that lasted for me. It's still to this day. It's like, well, how does that work? And so you just reverse engineer it. Of course, now there are a lot of things handier. You just go and find a YouTube video on how they did it. But at the time, it was a little more challenging. So anyway, so I had an R2. It was kind of like the Winchester Mystery House R2, though, because I never stopped rebuilding it. Once I got it to one thing, then I started making something else on it, and then I redid the feet, and then I redid this, and then I was going to redo the head. And
I think that's a common story with most R2 builders. There's always time to be one more thing to fix, and one more thing I can do it better. And never
totally, ending. Yeah, totally. Because you always want to add on to it or whatever. So, like I said, I continued doing my movie interest, and I got into theater in Chicago, doing live theater, set design, prop creation. I even dabbled in a little bit of acting. And also continued doing the makeup thing. And I met up with a guy that was this amazing makeup artist that was a protege of Rick Baker's and Dick Smith's, for that matter. He was younger than me, he was a few years younger than me, and he was actively consulting with them, and they were kind of teaching him long distance. And then he got a job at Rick's shop. And then about a year or so later, I called him and said, "How you doing?" And he told me about a job that was happening up in Northern California at Chris Walas's company. Chris Walas had done Gremlins and Enemy Mine, and he did the melting faces for Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Sweet.
Oh man, so many of my childhood nightmares.
Yeah. And so he was doing a movie called The Fly, and they said they were looking for people. So I sent in my portfolio, again, thinking I was going for the makeup artist thing. I sent in pictures of sculptures I had done, makeups I had done. And to be honest, I wasn't that good as a makeup artist. And then I threw in a few of the things like the R2-D2 and stuff like that. And Chris kind of was pushing aside when he was looking at reviewing my portfolio over the phone, he was pushing aside all the makeup stuff. And he says, "What's with this R2?" I said, "Oh yeah, I made that." And he goes, "Yeah, so you know how to do mechanical stuff?" And I said, "Oh yeah, sure. I didn't know. I just, first thing I learned in Hollywood is just say yes, and he's like, "You can do that stuff." I said, yeah. He says, "Yeah, you know how to use a mill and a lathe." And oh yeah. And I didn't even know what a mill was. I knew what a lathe was, so I didn't know what So I got off the call with him and asked my dad. I said, "What's a mill?" He goes, "Well, it's kind of like a drill press, And he explained, and I think I must have looked it up in a book somewhere, of course, pre-internet. So it's like, oh crap, I guess I have to figure out how to work one of those. So then about a week later, he gave me a call, said he would like me to come out and help in the mechanical department. So I moved out to California and been out here ever since, and worked on The Fly, and got to meet John Berg. And John Berg was Phil Tippett's animation partner. He did the chess set with Phil. He also did a lot of the creatures and Cantina with Phil. And then he was the Walker supervisor, while Phil was the Tauntaun supervisor on Empire Strikes Back. And John and I became fast friends, and it was still to this day. I mean, he became a mentor and a really, really good friend. And whenever we got the chance to work together, we did. And so that led to, once that work was done, I was looking for other work, and I found another local company, and I was doing Christmas windows. I was doing mechanical design for Christmas windows in San Francisco.
Wait, did you do it in the in Union Square, Macy's or whatever Christmas windows? I still go to those whenever I'm there.
It was iMagnons at the time.
Yeah, my dad used to work at iMagnons in the 80s. Right? That's so funny.
Yeah, this would have been 87, 80, 86, something like that. So one of the guys I met at that place was a guy named David Schaefer. And what David's job was, he was an electrical engineer. But what his job was, he was operating R2D2 for personal appearances for Lucasfilm. Long story to get to R2D2. Sorry,
it's a great trip.
Yeah, as long as we get to R2D2, then it's fine.
Yeah, now we got to R2D2. So I thought that was really cool. Hey, David, I built an R2, and he goes, "Oh, that's cool." So he had the opportunity to have R2 out, and I got to go see R2 for the first time. It was in the parking lot of his apartment complex in San Rafael, California. It wasn't at Lucasfilm, wasn't anything fancy. He brought it home because he was going to do some work on it, and that's what he did. And then that later in 87, roughly, they did opening of Star Tours in Disneyland, the very first Star Tours.
Right.
And while David was down there, he interviewed with Imagineering, and he got a job. And then at that same year, Lucasfilm signed a contract with Panasonic of Japan, or Matsushita of Japan, to do a series of commercials with the characters and with George as a spokesman for the company. And they were going to do this series of commercials, and R2D2 was featured in a lot of them. And so since David was not going to be there, they needed somebody to replace him. And so I recommended and hired them. And that's how I got to do R2. And my very first day on the job was with George Lucas, Peter Mayhew, Anthony Daniels, and R2D2. And Darth Vader. It wasn't David Prowse, but
wow. Yeah, my first day at the job, I was just hanging out with Chewbacca and C-3PO.
And the really cool thing is that they brought all the models from out of the archives, and they had them all set up on the main stage of ILM and for this commercial, so that the camera would fly down and George was amongst all these models. And so not only did I get to see the characters and everything, I got to see all the models right then and there too. So it was a real incredibly cool period of time. So
I was gonna say, I bet you had this total urge to just run up and just like pick up every model, look at it from every angle, and maybe play with it a little bit. But then you're like, no, gotta stay professional. This is my job. Cool. George Lucas is right here watching me.
Gotta be cool. But what happened eventually, I did get to work in the archives, and for the first 2 or 3 weeks, that's all I did do, was just sit and play with the models. And yeah, totally. Tried the costumes on.
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear that Peter Mayhew and Anthony Daniels were in the costumes for this commercial, it sounds like. Yeah,
well, up until like the mid 90s, whenever there was a commercial, something that they wanted, a big event that they wanted with C-3PO or a Chewbacca, those were the guys that they had to bring out because they felt that they were the only ones that they could fit into it. We eventually found local actors, so especially C-3PO, they wouldn't use anybody else for C-3PO for quite a while.
Yeah, well, that's really just interesting to hear. As a kid in the 80s or whatever, Star Wars was always playing. In my house, there probably wasn't a week that went by, but it's just interesting to hear that many years after the movies and with no other prequels or whatever in sight yet, that they were still getting those big actors for
it. And it was a weird time. Yeah. But at that time, Peter was still living in England too, so both Anthony and Peter were over there. So if they had to fly them out, they had to fly both of them first class. And Peter just by necessity, because he couldn't fit in an economy seat. Right. Anthony by star power, so yeah, so they reserve those for very, very, very special occasions.
We can get into those character appearances. Then you hinted at other actors taking over for the character appearances. So other than commercials, what did that then lead to? What other sorts of appearances?
R2 was the easiest to do because I was there. If it was local, especially something San Francisco, they wanted. I remember they did some sort of the celebrity luncheon or something in San Francisco. And the celebrity part of it was the celebrities waited on the paying people. Mm-hmm. So they would have like local San Francisco celebrities, mind you. So like Willie Mays and, other famous athletes and anybody that was famous. And of course, since George was famous in San Francisco, he was one of them. So they had George be one of the waiters at one of these things, and they wanted R2 there. So R2 was driving around. So
he's good at serving drinks. We saw him in
I was about to
sail barge.
We didn't have that drink tray thing. He was just there for the entertainment.
I don't think you want to spill drinks on R2.
No. Yeah, it's not exactly waterproof. So, and then we did a number of times we did like stuff for Disney. I remember we did this thing at where the Disney characters, Mickey and Minnie and R2 were there at some kids event, and there were so many of them here and there. I went down to Disney a number of times for private events where R2 was there. Went to Disney World for the opening of Star Tours there. Spent a week there, which was a lot of fun. We did a bunch of characters there. And mind you, anytime we did these character appearances, we were using the actual costumes. We weren't using like something that was made later. So if you saw Darth Vader in like the late 80s, early 90s, well, actually most of the 80s and into the 90s, that was a real costume that he was in. And of course, R2 was a real R2. It was a Empire Strikes Back era of R2. And C-3PO was a C-3PO that I think Anthony Daniels was at the Star Tours opening for that. Because Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher were there, along with Michael Eisner and George was there. And Jim Henson was there. It was like 2 weeks before he passed away. So, so I got to see him. I didn't meet him, but he was
So that means, all this time you had to keep R2-D2 up and running and presumably, changing out new parts and stuff like that. So you had to maintain R2 as well as be R2.
To a certain point, yeah. I think the most I ever did was I cleaned up, again, from my idea of like reverse engineering something. I kind of like would pull them apart to figure out how it was working, and then I would put it back together and simplify the parts. That way I understood what was going on. So I was constantly like tinkering with fuses and that sort of thing to make things simpler, get it out of the way so battery changes are easier and that kind of thing. I continued using the same radio controls that they were using post Return of the Jedi up until the prequels. Yeah, I did a little tinkering. Again, a little cosmetics here and there. There would be a ding or a scratch or whatever I'd have to take care of. I believe I stripped the head, had a clear coat on it of something that I had to strip off, or I sanded off so it would look better. Yeah, the little touches up here and there.
Now I'm imagining that you're like, where did the scratch come from? Is that a scratch that's supposed to be on there, or one that we accidentally added? And it's like, is this a screen use scratch? We have to keep it.
The funny thing about that too was that at the time, it wasn't until like Planet Hollywood moved into the ethos, roughly 1991, 92, that all of a sudden this stuff had like value. Of course, the stuff that in the archives we all considered the crown jewels of Lucasfilm, but that kind of like obsessive screen matching and stuff, things like what the prop store has to go through now to validate pieces, that wasn't a thing. It just, there it is, just let's reuse that, and you just pull it apart and reuse it for something else. So they weren't quite as sacred as they are now. And of course I would never do that now, but at the time it was like, oh yeah, just pull that part off that R2 and put it on that one, So
did you make it to the Mandalorian experience while you were at Celebration?
I didn't. It was always too long. So but yeah,
because they have all those screen used, but also screen using props and models and all that kind of stuff. Where they were like, when I saw Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni on the panel, they were like, "This is a real treat. Please, guys, don't touch anything. We need some of these things back on set in like 2 weeks." So I thought that was from what you're saying. When you shoot things digitally now and you have people who are double checking that scratch is a screen use scratch, as James says, you got to be a lot more careful.
It was funny when we were working on the prequels, and certainly by the time episode 3 came along, you knew that this stuff was going to be in a museum at one point. So there was something really odd about that you're futzing around with something that's you're just throwing together and throwing on your desk and, and everything. And someday someone's going to be taking white gloves and picking it up and carrying it very carefully and placing it into a case. It was a little trippy, after a while.
I'd imagine you're like, maybe I should clean this up a little more.
Yeah. Well, and I know there was one thing I was making for episode 2 was R2's back door had open and a dart came out and grabbed C-3PO's head and dragged it off his body in the Geonosis battle. And I had to make that door open, right? And I took the R2 that we had made for episode 1. So it wasn't original, but it was, it was original for episode 1. we were using R2s and the prequels that dated back to the very first film. There were bodies and heads that we were using from the very first film. But I had to take that body, I had to cut that door open, but then I had to, its back of the door was just like a piece of fiberglass, it didn't look like anything. So I had to come up with something. As I'm doing it, I'm thinking, I know the R2 builder is going to want the files for this, because they're going to want to recreate that. And then I see on Sideshow, is coming out with an episode 2 R2D2 and C3PO, and they recreated exactly what I did. So you add you have this mentality that is like, yeah, someone's going to sit there and obsess over these details. There's pieces that I've made, like the Darth Vader mask that goes on to Anakin at the end of Revenge of the Sith. I've been asked, like, what models did you use? And, there's hard drive readers in there. What model hard drive was it? It's like, I don't know. We happen to have a hard drive that died, and I opened it up and I pulled the readers out of it. That's what I used. So I have no idea what that was. And people identify this stuff. They they go through and identify it, which is really cool. I know people like have had to identify parts like off the Millennium Falcon.
Yeah, I talked to Lauren Peterson once about identifying the parts, and one time he said, one of the great things about when they changed scales is that they made the model kits for the Formula One cars in those same two scales, so he could just get the same part, but for the smaller scale or the bigger scale. But I had a question about R2. So you got to play probably with the Return of the Jedi R2 that has the saw blades?
No. That's the one we never reused, but it was still existing.
Okay, so but you've seen his saw blade thing?
Oh yeah.
Is it just one circular saw blade, or is there more than one?
I can't remember.
Because I swear, from watching the film, it always looked to me like there were two. You see one circular one, and then you see something glinting in the background, like it's also a blade, but nobody believes me. And so I was just looking for some confirmation there that there's two circular blades. What I
seem to recall, there exists in the archives this box of R2 arms that I don't think we used for the prequels whatsoever. Like the data port arm and everything was remade, so it wasn't the same one from the original films, but they all existed, and there's this big wooden box, and I seem to recall that was in there. And I think the way that saw blade worked was the blade spun, but then there was another wheel in the back that spun, that was attached to a motor. So it was via a pulley.
Okay, so you could, there's one blade, but two spin things.
Right. So I don't think that's another blade, but I think it might be a large wheel that's like a pulley. So,
okay.
I think.
So I was kind of right.
Yes.
Yeah. But so is everyone telling you were crazy. So
yeah. Well, now I'm going to have to go update that article that I wrote for Star Wars Insider.
Somewhere I think there's pictures of that somewhere.
I looked really hard for pictures of that. Yeah.
Yeah. If you ever come across one though, or when we're doing a panel sometime, if I see it, James, now that I know you have this hanging over your head. So, well, you mentioned the R2 builders. I didn't actually realize you had made an R2, younger as a kid. Did you also do the R2 building at ILM during the prequel era?
Yeah, I guess it was during episode 2, and it always frustrated me that I thought it would be really cool, because we were all getting into the digital design of 3D CAD programs and stuff like that. It would be great to create the ultimate R2 and done correctly, that we would all make patterns and mold them properly so that they would be almost like production type molds, not like one-offs, something you could get only one or two molds parts out of. And we started bouncing it around. It was Adam and Grant and Fawn and myself and John Duncan, I think, was another one. There were about 6 or 7 or 8 of us. We started working on it. I proposed it, and since I had access to the R2s, we could take the measurements, and then we also made a determination. Of course, we can't make a mold off of anything of the real thing. We'd have to create everything from scratch and make our own patterns, because we didn't want anyone to accuse us of stealing something from the archives or anything. And so we started doing that, and I made the feet. I think I made the foot pattern, And I laser cut it and put it together and everything. And then the idea was I had heard that on Empire Strikes Back that Tony Dyson, who had created the bodies and all the fiberglass parts for R2, made rigid molds. Typically you would make, the easier way to do it would be to make silicone molds, and so that you could lay up fiberglass rigid parts into them. And I thought this would be a great challenge because I'd seen pictures of the molds. We didn't have the molds, but I'd seen pictures of the molds where they did the bodies. Everything was in, but they did in a specific way so that you would have the undercuts and all the issues that you would have trying to pull off a rigid part off of another rigid part. So this is what I proposed to the group. This is what I wanted to do. And eventually people were getting antsy and wanting to progress their R2 along more. I was a little bit more slow and steady. And then they started making crappy molds. I won't say who.
Oh,
but Adam did finish first, right?
but somehow Adam finished first. Yeah. So I kind of lost interest. Other things were happening, and I just stepped away from it. I didn't finish the thing like the other guys did. And I'm not sure if that all of them used anything from what we were making. I think they must have had the parts or something, some of the raw parts, but other parts they bought by themselves. So,
but you can still finish yours, right? It's not done yet.
I don't have the parts. I never made the parts. I never took the castings.
Okay.
So I made a pattern and then I never took.
Gotcha. If it's not done yet, you can still finish it, or in this case, you could just start it.
So what I did was a few years ago, I built an R2 for a friend. Mm-hmm. And essentially I assembled an R2 for a friend. We bought all the parts off of from the R2 Builders Club, and I just assembled it together. And, I had to modify certain things, but at the time, the hardest thing to make is that darn dome. So there's a really good dome that's out there that gets occasional runs of. And when I was making this one, there was a run of the domes going. So I bought 2 domes and used it for one, and I've got the dome for the other one. So I have a dome a number of years ago. So the only found item on R2 is the little hollow eyes, where he projects Princess Leia's image out of. And those are reading lamps from an old British airplane from the 50s, a Vickers Viscount. When I was in London for episode 1, I saw the prop guys had that, and Ty Teeger, who was the prop master, I said, "Where'd you get those?" He said, "Oh, they're the company down the road kind of thing." So I knew about this company. I didn't get a chance to go down there and talk to them because I wanted a set of them. Mention this to one of the R2 builders or the R2 builders in general, and one guy found the company and bought them all out. And I don't know how many there were there. I seem to recall maybe it was about 50 or 60. That's all they had left.
He cornered the market on R2 holoprojector eyes.
He did, yeah. And they very graciously gave me 2 sets. So nice. I have 6 hollow eyes from the original Vickers Viscount airplane. But there's really good replicas out there now. Philip Wise is one guy that does a lot of them. Matter of fact, he made them for the hotel experience in Florida. Oh, wow. Because they're all over the ship, I guess. So he made those for those. But
yeah, well, and I do remember Fawn saying that he and Grant only finished their R2s a couple of years ago, after 20 years or whatever. So
yeah, a few months before Grant passed away, he texted me, he says, "Look what I did." I says, "Oh, finally." So
I know that Grant also played C-3PO in Attack the Clones, and you did some other appearances as well for what, special edition?
Well, yeah. So again, whenever I happen to be the right size, at least at that time I did, for general slate of characters. So Stormtrooper size and Boba Fett size and that sort of thing. So if they needed an extra Stormtrooper or they needed a Boba Fett for an appearance, I just jumped in the costume. I typically preferred not to because I was usually coordinating the thing. But again, they needed an extra body or whatever. One of the ones that I did Stormtrooper for was a Nintendo commercial that we shot in Atlanta, Georgia. And that was kind of a cool dream come true because I got to be a stormtrooper and I burst through an exploding door, when I was
Cool.
I even got a line. Well, the boy, where is he? Which
Wow.
I came back to San Francisco and we re-recorded my line, and I'm not sure they used it, but anyways, we would occasionally just jump in. So people like myself, Nelson Hall, who was a good friend that I've talked of before, and Grant ended up being, one day we were at the ranch, and this is before he worked for ILM, and I knew we were having this appearance coming up at the ranch. It was called the Star Wars Summit, and it was in anticipation of Episode 1 and all the run up that they were going to do to Episode 1. So this is 96, late 96 or something like that. And we needed a bunch of characters, and obviously, as I was saying, C-3PO was always difficult to do. You could only really use Anthony Daniels. Well, they weren't going to fly Anthony Daniels out to do a 5-minute appearance at the ranch. So I'm looking at Grant, and I said, "Come up to the archives after work or on your lunch hour." And I said, "Let's see if you could fit in something." And so I put him in the C-3PO costume, and sure enough, he fit more or less. He was the same height, but Grant's body was longer than Anthony's, and his legs were shorter. So he had a little harder time with the legs, but he worked around it. So we put him in for that. And so there were a number of appearances where Grant popped in as C-3PO, and then he started doing more and more. I left to go back to ILM, and the people that took over for me at the ranch then that's when the special editions were coming out, and then, like I said, the run up to Episode 1. So there was a lot of publicity coming out at that time, video releases and that. So Grant got to do the premiere of the special edition in LA. He did the Oprah show.
Wow.
He did Dennis Muren got a star on the Walk of Fame. He did that. So there were a number of ones that he did. And then when the special editions were happening, again, like I said, because I was that generic stormtrooper size, and I was at the archive still at that point, when they'd say, "Oh, what size person should we get for this guy?" I was like, "Well, I could wear it," and so I was a stormtrooper, then I was Imperial officer, and so I'm all over the movies, the special editions, as when they added scenes.
For all of Don's stories about working on set and being in character, including as Boba Fett, join us for our next episode, part 2 of this great interview. It went really long, so we're just going to have to split it into 2 episodes. Look for that in a couple of weeks. And if you'll be at Comic-Con this year, James and I are both hosting panels. I'm hosting one called The Mandalorian Under the Helmet, about all of the different jobs and roles that the Mandalorian takes on. We're going to have a real-life bounty hunter, someone who is a blacksmith, and all sorts of other aspects of the Mandalorian's character to chat more about that. And James will be hosting Science of Jurassic World with paleontologists, geneticists, and we'll both have people who worked on those projects as part of our panels. So if you're coming to Comic-Con, check those out and come say hi.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologys. Join us for part 2 of this interview on our next episode. We'd like to thank our guest, Don Bies, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at Star Warsologies, that's OLOGIES @gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook now. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service.
We are also part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including Collectopolis, Resilient Squadron, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. And speaking of YouTube, we also have some fabulous YouTube videos of the nature documentaries that were created for our Galactic Critters panel at Celebration. So check those out as well.
See you next time on Star Warsologies for part 2 of this interview with Don Bies. Thanks for joining us.